finish up today here in chapter 4 of the book of Romans. So, one of the big issues, and we talked about this last week, is this phrase, the righteousness of God, has a big role in the book of Romans. There's different ways to read it. There's an objective way to read it, the phrase. That has to do with the righteousness God himself has. God is righteous. We saw in chapter 1 that is pretty much how Paul uses the phrase. But now, in chapter 4, he talks a little bit about how that is applied. Not the righteousness God has, but the righteousness that he gives. And almost said last week, but the week before last, when I was here, before we did the Jeopardy, which I think is great, by the way. That was probably the most fun class you've had so far. Right. You got to have some fun with it. Paul uses these three phrases, and I want to hit them again before I go back into chapter 4 and tie this off, because there's different ways to talk about Christianity and what happens. But he uses these three phrases: justification, redemption, and propitiation. And I don't think that they're identical with each other. And in fact, the way Paul uses them, I think each one builds upon the previous. So, justification is something when a judge pardons you, and so now you're not punished for what it is that you have done. Redemption is a little bit like buying back. You've lost something and you purchase it back. And then propitiation is more a sacrificial metaphor, the idea that God turns his face away from your wrongdoing and another life substitutes for your own. Now, one of the big issues in chapter 4 he has to deal with, and in the lesson here, if you've still got the lesson, anybody need a lesson who doesn't have one? No. What's that? I'm picking up on page 23. And then, Eli, go find your mom, because she might have extra lessons. We'll set them out here. Abraham's an interesting character because Paul wants to draw attention to the fact that he was a pagan. He and his ancestors worshipped other gods. It comes through very, very clearly in Joshua, particularly. And but he was justified by faith because he trusted the Lord. And what's important for Paul in this passage is that Abraham trusted God and was justified before he was actually circumcised. Because the ritual has become important for a lot of Jews as the point at which somebody becomes saved. And it's relevant for us as Christians because we think the same way about baptism. Oftentimes, think the same way about baptism. A lot of times in Christian circles, we're eager to get young people baptized. Nothing wrong with that per se, but baptism is sort of the closing of a deal that is already in process. So in chapter 4, verse 1, I'll just read some of this and talk our way through it. The lessons here, we'll see if Eli finds the other lessons. But we'll just read this and talk our way through it. Chapter 4, verse 1. What shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? If Abraham was justified by works, he certainly had something to boast about, but not before God. But what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited him as righteousness. This is from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. To the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. Now, verse 4 is important because Paul's drawing a distinction between when God owes you something and when he gives something that he doesn't owe you. A gift is not owed to you. But your wages are. And to the one who does not work but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. And so here Paul quotes the 32nd Psalm. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. That probably is important coming from David because what did David do? Bible trivia. Yo, go.
He killed the husband of Bathsheba so he could get with her.
Okay. He killed the husband of Bathsheba, or he was even sneakier than that.
Caused his death not delayed.
He arranged so that he might die by someone else's hand because he had already committed adultery. Now, if you know anything about the law of ancient Israel, adultery gets what penalty? Death. It's capital punishment. Now, adultery doesn't mean any sexual sin whatsoever. Adultery is not like when two young unmarried people have a relationship. It means crossing over into somebody else's marriage. That's adultery. So that gets the death penalty. And murder certainly gets the death penalty. But did David ever receive the death penalty? And there's not really an explanation, but you kind of get a hunch as to why. Probably because he was the king. I mean, do people in power get away with stuff? Are you sure? I mean, yeah, they tend to get away with stuff. So David, if he was not the king and he had gotten caught at this, he probably would have received the death penalty. What's that? Well, he wasn't really publicly caught. We know that the prophet Nathan knew what was going on. The prophet Nathan confronted him privately and said, I want to tell you a story. And that's sort of like, uh-oh, he knows. Did the larger nation of Israel know? Probably not. But somebody knew because it's here in our text, isn't it? So anybody who wants to say that these stories were invented, no. If I'm going to invent a story about myself, this is not the story I would invent. It's what in law court they call admission against interest. If you admit to doing something that is not in your best interest to admit, it's probably true, because why would anybody make up a story that just made themselves look bad, right? Aeneas, the father of the Roman people, is a much better person than King David. But we might suspect that maybe Aeneas is largely a mythical figure, and that the guy that we're reading about in Virgil's Aeneid wasn't actually this good. The Jews are, they're harder. They're harder on their leaders and the records that have been handed down about them. So when we get to verse 7 and 8 of chapter 4 of Romans, which is from Psalm 32, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. That's powerful, coming from either the hand of David. It's attributed to David at any rate. He knew that he probably deserved the death penalty, but he had received grace. So Paul continues in verse 9, is this blessing only for the circumcised or for the uncircumcised? So, who does God forgive? That was a big question that came up this week in England. I had one student ask me, does God send Jews who do not accept Christ to hell? It's a pretty direct question. I just love being put on the spot like that. And I said, well, typically I give two answers, and my first answer is, I don't know. God hasn't given me the business. But the second answer was, I don't think so. In other words, we can't simply assume that by performing a certain ritual or subscribing to a certain statement of faith, that's what saves a person. Christ saves people. That's what it means to be a Christian, to believe that the grace that Jesus Christ accomplished on the cross, nobody deserves to be saved. Nobody merits salvation. This unmerited grace of what Jesus did on the cross, but who knows to whom it extends, right? Will we meet people in heaven we did not expect to see there? I imagine we will. And will there be people in heaven who we thought, where are they? In other words, me self-identifying as a Christian is not what saves me. Yeah.
That passage in the Psalms raises an interesting question similar to the question we're dealing with, and that is, did God forgive people's sins in the Old Testament apart from the sacrificial system? And it sounds like the answer would be yes, in this, the way the psalmist is.
Yeah. The sacrificial system certainly raised the consciousness of everybody who participated in it. They would see that they were saved in and through the sacrifice of a life. But you could still, to be aware of, you can still benefit from the food that you eat without being aware of how the processes of digestion work. And in the same way, you have pre-Israelite people who we don't really know that they ever participated in Christ. We don't know if they participated in the sacrificial system. Enoch is said to have walked with a God. We don't really know too much about Enoch, but those are examples for sure. So that was a big question I had to answer, and so I threw that out there with the students. We usually have a Q&A on Thursday night, and I had about 27 different questions I had to ask and then answer, because the idea is that I get on a plane the next day, and so no matter what I say, they can't stone me to death. So we have this thing where we do with the class, where I teach the class in Leviticus. We talk about God, we talk about the Bible and religious things, and then they get to ask me any question whatsoever, and I have to answer it. But there's an advantage there, because a lot of times in our families and in our churches, a lot of times we're not straight with each other because we have to live with each other the next day. But then in these little classes, I get to answer very directly. And the kids ask some pretty tough questions. And it gives them a chance to get hold of something and then to think about it. Now, the follow-up question was, do you think you should still evangelize people? And I said, of course. Of course you evangelize. Like Rabbi Glenn asked me that when he was part of my ordination committee, whether we should try to get Jews to believe in Jesus? And I said, absolutely. Even if you think a person can be saved by Jesus without knowing that they're saved by Jesus, why wouldn't you share that with them? Because, of course, the gospel makes us better people. It raises our consciousness. It gives our lives, it helps us to live better lives. And so you should always evangelize people and always try to bring them to faith in Jesus Christ. And it isn't because you have to believe that if you don't close the deal, they'll go to hell. The issue is that it's better for them. It's better for me to believe in Jesus. It's better for you. It's better for everybody to believe in Jesus. And so we kind of had that conversation, and Paul's doing that in this passage. So back to Romans chapter 4, he's got a group of Jewish people that feel that unless people are circumcised, unless they do exactly what Moses laid down in the Torah, they're in a whole lot of trouble, and they will not be accepted by God. And Paul, even though Paul is for us kind of as orthodox as they come, he is not viewed as an orthodox religious person at this time. He's viewed as a radical. This is considered a radical, wild idea. Let me stop, though, and see if there's any questions before I read a little bit further into this. Yeah.
I'm confused. Are you subscribing to a universalist type?
No. No, not universalism. So there is a heaven, there is a hell. So I wouldn't subscribe to the idea that everybody's saved. But can a person be saved through the grace of Christ without knowing it? Sure. I mean, if I went back in a time machine and I asked King David whether or not he was saved by Jesus, he would say, well, who's Jesus? He's not aware that Christ has saved him. I don't know if that example helps. Yeah.
And you answered, I think you said you answered that question two ways. The first one was that you don't know.
Yes.
Which I think fits pretty closely with what Paul says in another of his letters, where he says, do not pronounce judgment before the time.
Yeah.
The Lord will bring to light hidden things and disclose the purposes of people's hearts, but nobody knows that except God, and there's no way to tell by looking at them. So don't pronounce judgment before the time. That's a direct statement.
No, you can't pronounce. And it's not up to us to pronounce judgment. The language of damnation in the Bible is pretty strong. So I've never been able to embrace universalism. No, that's fine. You can ask, because there are some Christian theologians who do embrace universalism within all traditions of the church, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. You'll find universalists who think that damnation is not really a thing that happens. I've wrestled with that over the years, but no, I think it happens. There are people who aren't going to make it. The prophets certainly communicate aggressively the idea that you can reject God, and you can face the consequences of that. And I believe that. I believe that there are people who ultimately do reject God. And that doesn't have so much to do with whether they sign their name to a faith statement, but it has to do with a persistent rebelliousness of the heart. God will not force salvation on people against their will. And a lot of that has to do with whether people believe in the life to come. In my experience dealing with people, a lot of people make decisions in the present life. Even people who self-identify as Christians often treat the present life as though this is all that there is, and that they have to do it now, or that's it. And I always kind of raise my eyebrow at that, because that's just a very irreligious way of living life, you know. And we all struggle with it, because I'm 47, 48 years old, and it's very tempting to think, well, this is the only life that there is, and I've got to do what's right for me now. But that's not a Christian way of thinking. We have to believe that we're going to live forever, and that the things that we do now, the commitments we make now, the things that we suffer now, they matter. And that's what enables us, I think, to go through the tough times. You know, a lot of times we got tough times we got to go through. Who would go through it? Who would put up with it? Unless there was a real belief, you know, that this isn't the end. So Paul continues. Let's see. I'm killing time today. I got like 15, 20 minutes. Chapter 4. He draws attention to the fact that Abraham, his faith was credited as righteousness before he was circumcised. So that's important. And we could apply the same thing to baptism. If somebody wants to get baptized, we assume that the outward ritual is not the point at which they're saved. And the same thing is in a marriage. I hope when I bring the bride and the groom before the altar and I say, "Do you take this man?" I'm hoping this is just a formality. It's not in a lot of these Hollywood movies, but that they've already made up their mind that this is what they're going to do, and that we're just observing this in public. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. So anybody who has faith is Abraham's child, even if they're not biologically descended from him, and even if they don't go through the ritual. And that kind of ties in with what we were just talking about. There's a certain incognito that attaches to who's saved and who isn't, because you can't tell by looking at who they were born from, and you can't tell by looking at whether or not they've just done a ritual. It doesn't work that way. There's an inner activity of the Spirit of putting their faith in God. That's what closes the deal. Nothing else closes the deal. And to make him the father of the circumcised who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Now that's kind of a parting shot, I think, from Paul, because he's actually turning it around and saying not only was Abraham saved before he was circumcised, but that means that people who are circumcised, that's not what guarantees their salvation. You know, what guarantees their salvation? Well, this phrase, walk in the footsteps of the faith that he had. So, authenticity, right? I hope when I stand before the Lord in judgment, I'll have something better to speak for me than a baptismal certificate. I'm going to hold it up and say, well, hang on. We had a deal. I mean, it's nothing wrong with that, but it's like, well, that's not quite how the system works. Verse 13. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world, that came up a lot this week, heir of the world, because a lot of people were asking whether the Jewish claim to the land of Israel is still in force today, because they're asking about Israel and Hamas, right? And what side of this big political debate should they take? And quite a few Christians have argued that the promises of the Old Testament to the people of Israel to inhabit the land are still in force today, and that therefore they should politically support Israel. And so students ask me what I thought about that. Like, boy, great. When's my flight leave? You know, they're asking me all these questions that are like politically charged, and then I have to answer them. And then I said, look, I don't think the promises of the nation of Israel today is not the same as it was in the days of old. I don't think that's how it works. Christians and Jews together stand not only to inherit the land of Israel, but the whole earth. Right? Blessed are the meek. They will inherit the earth. So this is not a political issue about fighting for a tract of land in the Middle East. Christians and Jews both who believe in Christ, why would they fight for this little piece of land? They're going to inherit everything. God is their father. They stand to inherit everything. You can support Israel if you do support it for any number of reasons that you might support any other nation that's trying to carve out a space for itself. But it has nothing to do with the prophecies of the Bible.
And also, since Abraham's descendants are defined by faith as opposed to their pedigree, then the descendants of Abraham is not just another word for Jews.
Right.
Which I think sometimes people kind of make that assumption, but that's not the way Paul is arguing anyway.
That's right. And this language goes into the New Testament. They asked me, and I said, I consider myself a Jew. I'm a true Jew. And, well, the boys know. We celebrate Passover, don't we?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Exactly highly formal, but
It's not highly formal, but we remember the Exodus story. I have a little bit of Jewish blood. How much? Do you know?
No, she was a full-blooded Jew.
Okay. There's a little bit in there.
Great.
That's not really what it's about, though. It's about faith. And by faith, we become children of Abraham. But you have a question or a thought.
Well, the people were chosen, they didn't have faith when they were chosen by God.
Mm-hmm.
The people that he chose. So isn't there a special,
Did they still have a special role?
they didn't have faith. They were, right? I mean, they were just a little people. They weren't big. They weren't, you know.
They were the smallest of the nations, I think the text says. Yeah.
They had faith, though. They had the pillar and smoke.
Not when they were chosen. They were chosen, that was after, wasn't it? I mean, the pillar and all that.
Well, the act of choosing Israel probably happened from eternity. But,
So are they not chosen?
oh, they're chosen.
Are we the chosen? Because we're, by faith, Abraham is chosen.
Now, nobody asked me that. You should have been at the Q&A. You should have been at the Q&A. I believe that I and this church are chosen by God. But we would not have been chosen except in and through his choosing of Israel. Israel was always his servant. I think that's the language Isaiah uses. Israel was his servant. So it's not like And Paul has to deal with this in Romans. I think later on in the book, we're not at the passage yet, he addresses Gentiles who maybe look down now on their Jewish brethren and say, well, I'm chosen, same as you. And Paul issues a warning to them and says, well, don't get cocky, because you can be cut off too. The passage I'm thinking of, and I'll take a quick look at it just by way of anticipation.
You're talking about chapter 11, where he's talking about being grafted in?
I think that's right, yeah. Because Paul has gone out of his way so much in this book to challenge the Jewish idea of supremacy that I think by the time he gets to chapter 11, he's a little anxious that maybe the Gentile faction will start going in the opposite direction. And so chapter 11...
I think you're looking at verse 17.
Yeah, I'm going to start in verse 13, though, because there he directly addresses the Gentiles. He says, now I'm speaking to you, Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. If the root is holy, so are the branches. But, verse 17, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. I think that's what he's saying there. He's saying, well, look, you wouldn't be here but for the Jews. So don't be arrogant about it. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. So I think that's a good point. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. So they are the opposite of faith. They were broken off because of lack of faith. You stand fast through faith. Don't become proud, but be afraid or fear. And I like that. So he's like, well, it goes both ways. If they were broken off so that you could be grafted in, that still holds. If God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but kindness toward you. Provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they don't continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. So here he's, I think, maybe addressing some of what that passage came to mind when you said what you did, because that's the first thing that popped into my mind. Yeah.
Part of the question, too, I think, at least in his larger parameters, is God chose Israel, but chose them for what?
Right. Not salvation.
No, he chose them to serve his purpose. So they are chosen to be a servant of the Lord and to fulfill a role that he wants for them to fulfill. That's not quite the same thing as being saved, chosen to serve.
Yeah, and I think that's an area where Calvinists and non-Calvinists tend to go in different directions, because the language of election or choosing for us as Christians immediately suggests salvation. But maybe a good example would be Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. He certainly was elected by God, and he served God against his own intent. But he wasn't a good guy, and so the idea is that God elects people throughout the Old Testament. Within the Old Testament, some of the elect are saved, some of them aren't, but all of them serve. All of them serve God's purpose. And this is where the new perspective stuff that we've talked about in previous weeks gets into some difficult territory, because that shifts in the New Testament. Since salvation is by grace through faith, when you are elected of God in the New Testament, salvation kind of gets thrown in as part of the deal. But that's a little bit different than it is in the Old Testament. And so I haven't written him about it, but that's one of the things that I think N.T. Wright doesn't quite... I like him. I think he's a great scholar, but I don't think he quite gets. Because he sees a parallelism in election between the New Covenant and the Old, and they're not entirely parallel. If you're elected in the New Covenant, not only are you God's servant, you're saved too. Those two things go because you receive the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is the life that raises again from the dead. So, I had a few things in Q&A that I did this last week that were like that, where I kind of got on a platform and then I said a few things for a few minutes and everybody went, They sensed that I said something profound, but I don't know that they quite got everything that I was getting at. So that's why we go out and have dinner, and they ask me more specific questions. We kind of go through it case by case. So, but verse 13 to the end, the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir to the world, I think that's an important phrase, because that sets this issue of the land. Israel is a shadow of the things that are to come. The issue is not that they're promised this little plot of land in some Middle Eastern territory. God's ultimate plan is for his people to inherit the whole earth. And that comes through very much in the teaching of Jesus. If, verse 14, it is the adherents of the law who are to be heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring. Not only the adherent of the law, but also the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So here he does contrast faith and the law very explicitly. And by the law, he seems to be referring to the rituals through which the Israelite people distinguish themselves. Verse 17, I have made you the father of many nations in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. In hope, he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told, so shall your offspring be. That's interesting, because it suggests that hope comes in a certain sense before faith. We all know Paul's famous triad: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. But in some ways, hope is the fertile soil of religious life, right? Faith comes out of that. Verse 19, he did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God. He grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God. So, hope, believing that God will keep his promises, gives birth to trust, living life with a confidence that God will bring these things about. Fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And that is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness. I think we can see that just in ordinary life, and then we'll see if there's any comment about this before we close. But when you know, in human affairs, we don't trust each other too much. I don't know if you've noticed that. Yeah. Because life is a bad business, you know. You put your trust in people and they disappoint you. And so we very seldom find in this life, even with people who are comparatively good people, we don't find a perfect repository of trust. And that makes sense because, I mean, who among us ultimately trusts even our own selves? I mean, you're a fool. If if you think that you're perfectly trustworthy, no, you're not. So the issue is, well, who do you trust? God alone is worthy of our ultimate trust, right? He alone can keep every single promise he makes. So it's counted as righteousness when Abraham believes God. He believes in God so much that he risks everything because God is that trustworthy. And that's important. We all need that. Everybody needs something to put their trust in. And we can find relationships with other people that are more trustworthy than others, and that's great and everything, but not perfectly so. Never perfectly so. God alone is the repository of that. All right. Now, next week, I got to go into the practical side of this. So let me see if there's any comment or question today. I have to apologize. Today's lesson's a little scattered. I kind of read through and talked about different things because I'm back from England and I'm all over the map. But
Question, what do you think Paul means when he says, in hope he believed against hope? That's in verse 18.
Verse 18, in hope he believed against hope. I'll give two answers. First is, I don't know. That's the safe answer. I'm a little Kierkegaardian about this one. I think that he believed against reason. He believed against probability. He believed against what seemed likely the case. Now, when does a person believe against what is likely the case? It's largely a question of moral passion and affirming that there is a good in the world that is so good we can even call our own reason into question. Our own, because as human beings we weigh probabilities, don't we? And we calculate and we connive and we maneuver and we try to figure out the best deal. But there's something very spiritless about all of that. There's something very faithless, not believing passionately that there's a good that is beyond our petty calculation. So that's what I think he's getting at there, and I think that's why God credits it to him as righteousness, because he says, here, this is a person I can work with.
Contrary to the evidence, I guess, is what you're saying? Is that what you're saying?
I would even go so far as that.
Evidence, big part of evidence is what you...
Believing against the evidence.
What your reason tells you, or what
Yeah.
you're convinced of. That's a type of evidence, I suppose, that you rely on. You're saying it goes even beyond that. Beyond evidence.
I think it does. I mean, that's scandalous, but I think that it does. It even goes against the evidence. I don't think that you can't provide good evidential arguments for belief in God or Christianity. That's what apologists do. But there are certain elements of our faith that push against common sense evidence. I believe Jesus rose from the dead. But that's not something that happens on a regular basis, unless I'm mistaken. Oh yeah, it happens all the time. People rise from the dead. It's like, what? No, they don't. And so I would say I believe it passionately, because it's an expression of my faith in the God who keeps his promises. And so there's a personal stepping out.
Well, yeah, there's something that transcends the evidence, which is
Yeah.
God's promise.
So there I think Paul is, sounds a little existentialist to me there. That's a good question. That's where I go with that passage, because believing hope against hope. What hope is he believing against? The hope that ordinary, rational people who calculate would have. But he said he's 100 years old. Who believes that when they're 100 years... How old are you?
Not 100.
No.
I'm 74.
70. Okay, so in 25 years, you and Mom are going to have a child, and you're going to produce a vast nation of people.
That's why Sarah
From
laughed.
that child.
Yeah, Sarah laughed, so I would laugh too. I'd like, okay, no, that's not going to happen. So I think there's something to that, yeah. I got to let you go. Good class today. Thank you all very much, sir.